They had been planning it for weeks. Four friends in their early 20s, all restless in that late summer lull between responsibilities and adulthood, had decided that a camping trip would be the perfect escape. The mountain range they chose wasn't unfamiliar to them. They had hiked sections of it before, though never this deep, never this far. It was August of 2006, the tail end of the season when the days were long but the nights were already carrying a bite of cold. To them, it felt like the perfect adventure. To their families, it felt safe enough, close to home, familiar terrain, something young people did all the time without consequence. They were not reckless. That's what their parents always stressed in later interviews. These weren't the kind of kids who vanished because they wanted to, or who set out to take dangerous risks. They packed carefully, made checklists, borrowed tents and gear, even checked the weather forecast. Each of them had told someone where they were going and when they would be back. They promised it was just for the weekend. They would hike out Friday afternoon, camp overnight, then spend Saturday exploring a trail that looped around the ridgeline before descending back to the trailhead on Sunday. By Monday, they were supposed to be back at work or class, slipping easily into the rhythm of their young lives. That never happened. On Friday morning, the four of them loaded their packs into a beat-up sedan and drove toward the mountains. Witnesses at a gas station remembered them laughing, buying snacks, filling up on fuel. Someone recalled how one of them pointed toward the peaks and said, "That's where we'll be by tonight." They parked near the trailhead just after midday. A ranger would later confirm the car was still there 2 weeks later, untouched, its windows dusty from rain and wind, as if frozen in time. Their names mattered to the people who loved them, but in the public imagination, they quickly became a group, the Four Campers. 2 men, 2 women, all friends since high school. They had grown up in the same small town and were still tightly bound, even as college and jobs had begun to scatter them in different directions. This trip was supposed to be a reunion of sorts, one last breath of freedom before the grind of adulthood pulled them apart. Families described them as bright, responsible, and full of plans. None of them had criminal records, none had drug problems, and none had expressed any desire to disappear. They were ordinary young people, eager for one more adventure before summer ended. That evening, when the sun set behind the peaks, no one knew they had just entered a story that would stretch on for nearly 2 decades. At first, there was nothing to suggest trouble. Hikers who came down the trail that weekend didn't notice anything unusual. No calls for help, no strange weather patterns, nothing that would raise alarm. The mountain was quiet, still holding its secrets. Families waited through Friday night, then Saturday. Not worried yet because plans often stretched. Maybe they had lingered at the lake or added an extra night under the stars. By Sunday afternoon, when calls went unanswered, worry set in. By Monday morning, the families contacted the sheriff's office. The first hours after a report of missing hikers are always critical. Deputies drove to the trailhead and found the sedan sitting exactly where it had been left. Inside were jackets they hadn't taken, a few personal items, and a fast food receipt from earlier that week. The car gave investigators a starting point, but not much else. There were no notes left behind, no sign of forced entry, no clue as to what direction they had headed once they stepped onto the trail. The sheriff's office quickly contacted search and rescue teams, and the families rushed to the site, desperate but still hopeful. Early interviews captured that optimism. Parents and siblings spoke to reporters with voices that trembled but tried to stay steady. They said things like, "They probably just got turned around," or "They might have taken a longer loop than they planned." It wasn't denial, it was genuine belief. Everyone assumed 4 young, healthy campers would reappear at any moment, walking tired but smiling out of the trees. Searchers clung to that same hope. In those first days, the idea of a tragic outcome felt unthinkable. The community responded as small towns often do. Volunteers signed up to help search. Neighbors dropped off food for the families keeping vigil at the trailhead. Local news ran stories of smiling faces, graduation photos, and promises that search crews were doing everything possible. Helicopters lifted off from nearby airfields, circling the ridgelines with spotters leaning out, scanning for bright colors against the green and gray terrain. Ground teams combed trails, shouting names into the silence. Dogs followed scents that quickly faded in the shifting wind. Each day ended with updates that sounded hopeful but produced nothing. What haunted the families most was the silence. In most cases, missing hikers leave behind something: a backpack, a fire pit, a trail of gear dropped in panic. Here, there was nothing. The mountain swallowed them whole. With every passing hour, optimism thinned, replaced by an edge of fear that no one wanted to voice. Reporters began asking harder questions. Could they have met with foul play? Could someone else have been on the trail? Were they caught in a sudden storm? The families pushed back, insisting their children were strong, resourceful, and capable. They still believed the four friends would walk out at any moment, but as the second night passed and then the third, that optimism began to crack. The mountain remained silent. The car still sat at the trailhead, and the families who had once spoken with confidence now began to wait with dread, not just hope. What was supposed to be a simple weekend adventure had become something else entirely, a mystery that no one yet understood, and one that would soon consume the attention of an entire state. At first, the search carried with it a sense of urgency. The belief that the four friends were still somewhere on the mountain, lost, injured, but alive. Search and rescue crews arrived within hours of the family's call, unloading equipment, mapping out routes, and setting up a temporary command post at the trailhead. Helicopters were quickly dispatched, circling high above the ridgeline, their spotters peering down into the rugged terrain. It was late August, the skies still clear enough to allow long flights, and rescuers believed that visibility would work in their favor. Bright tents, discarded clothing, even a small fire could have been spotted from the air. But as each hour passed, the search returned nothing. No tents, no smoke, no movement at all. On the ground, teams of trained searchers fanned out in every direction. They combed the trail system, cutting through brush and climbing over rock outcroppings, shouting the campers' names into the wilderness. Search dogs strained against their leashes, noses pressed to the dirt, eager to lock onto a scent. For a while, the dogs seemed to lead somewhere, up along a side trail that veered toward the higher ridges. But after half a mile, the trail dissolved. The handlers reported that the dogs circled and circled, confused, as if the scent had been lifted away by the shifting wind. It was the first of many dead ends that would come to define the operation. Over the following days, the effort grew into one of the largest search and rescue missions the county had ever seen. Dozens of volunteers joined, bringing ATVs, horses, and supplies. National Guard helicopters were called in, equipped with thermal imaging technology that could detect body heat even in dense forest. Rescuers swept the valleys and ridgelines during the day and returned at night exhausted, only to plan out new grids by lantern light. Every new morning carried hope. Every evening carried disappointment. It was as if the four young hikers had stepped off the trail and simply ceased to exist. On the third day, a glimmer of progress seemed to appear. Searchers discovered a faint line of boot prints in soft soil not far from the main ridge. The prints matched the tread of hiking boots, and investigators believed they could belong to at least two members of the group. The tracks moved in the expected direction, deeper along the ridge trail, before suddenly stopping at a section of exposed rock. Beyond that, nothing. No broken branches, no disturbed soil, no scuffs on the stone. The boot prints simply ended. Rescuers searched in widening circles, scanning every direction for signs of where the hikers had gone, but the trail never resumed. It was as if the mountain had erased them. Days turned into a week, and the strain began to show. Families who had initially clung to optimism grew restless, their faces lined with exhaustion as they waited for updates. Reporters camped out at the trailhead, interviewing officials who tried to stay measured in their words. They emphasized that rescues in wilderness cases often took time, that survival was still possible, that people had been found alive after weeks in the wild. But privately, some officials admitted their concern was growing. The mountain was too quiet. There were no scraps of food wrappers, no torn clothing, no makeshift shelters. Experienced hikers rarely vanish without leaving behind some trace. Here, there was only silence. Weather complicated the effort further. On the 8th day, storms rolled across the ridgeline, dropping sheets of cold rain that made the terrain treacherous and washed away any fragile evidence left in the soil. Helicopters were grounded for 2 days. Ground crews slogged through mud and rising creeks, fighting both exhaustion and the creeping dread that they were chasing shadows. One deputy later recalled the feeling of futility, that no matter how hard they searched, the mountain gave nothing back. By the second week, the operation was scaled back. What had begun with dozens of searchers and buzzing helicopters dwindled into smaller, quieter teams. Volunteers returned home. The National Guard withdrew. Families pleaded for the effort to continue, but officials had to admit the truth. Without new evidence, they could no longer justify the scale of the operation. The 4 campers were officially listed as missing, presumed dead. The search ended without bodies, without gear, without explanation. The final report read like so many other wilderness disappearances, thorough, procedural, yet hollow. It documented the grids covered, the aerial sweeps completed, the boot prints that led nowhere. It logged every tip, every false lead, every hour spent combing ridges and valleys. And yet, the conclusion remained the same. There was no sign of the 4 friends beyond the trailhead. Their car sat untouched, their families left, with only questions. When the last rescue team packed up their tents and equipment, the mountain fell silent again. The command post emptied, and the trailhead, once buzzing with activity, returned to stillness. For the families, the silence was unbearable. They had begged for one more day, one more search, one more chance to find something, anything, that could explain what had happened. Instead, they were left staring at the mountainside, knowing their children were still out there somewhere, hidden by the wilderness just beyond reach. That silence would stretch on for years, hardening into the cruelest kind of mystery. A disappearance with no evidence, no witnesses, no conclusion. The search had failed, and the mountain, for the moment, had won. In the weeks after the search was called off, the families and investigators were left with nothing but questions, and questions quickly turned into theories. Without evidence, every possibility seemed both reasonable and impossible at the same time. The simplest explanation, the one most people reached for first, was that the 4 friends had strayed from the trail. The ridge network was notorious for side paths that led to steep drops or meandering detours. If they had taken the wrong turn, it was conceivable they wandered so far off course that searchers never crossed their path. But seasoned rescuers pushed back against that idea. For 4 people to go missing together, with not a single item of gear left behind, was rare. Wrong turns usually ended with someone stumbling onto a recognizable trail, leaving behind markers, or being spotted in the valleys below. Here, there had been nothing. Another theory was weather. Mountains were unpredictable, even in August. Sudden storms could sweep across ridgelines with little warning, burying campers under rock slides or driving them into hypothermia overnight. The week of the disappearance, however, weather logs showed only light winds and occasional rain. No major storm system had passed through. Still, the families clung to the idea that maybe a sudden microburst or lightning storm had forced the hikers into a dangerous spot. Some wondered if they had huddled together in a gully for shelter, only to be swept away by flash flooding. But no flood debris was ever located, and the terrain around the ridge didn't show signs of a washout. Then there was the darker possibility: an animal attack. Black bears were common in the region, and mountain lions occasionally prowled the ridges. But even predators leave evidence: torn clothing, blood traces, drag marks. Investigators scoured for any sign of disturbance and found none. Experts reminded the families that predators rarely target groups. 4 healthy adults together would have made too much noise, too much movement for most animals to risk. If wildlife had been involved, it would have been violent and messy, and searchers would have known. The absence of such evidence made the theory unlikely, though it remained in circulation among locals who believed the wilderness always held its own dangers. As hope faded, suspicion turned toward human involvement. Could foul play have been responsible? The idea was difficult for families to accept, but investigators had to consider it. 4 people don't vanish without a trace unless something or someone intervened. Deputies interviewed anyone known to be in the area that weekend. Other hikers, hunters, and campers were questioned. Some described hearing faint sounds at night, voices, maybe even a scream carried by the wind. But none of it could be verified. No one had seen the group past the trailhead. Rumors spread that another person had been on the mountain, someone who might have crossed paths with them. But without bodies or crime scenes, the notion of a killer remained speculation, a theory built on fear rather than fact. Among locals, a different explanation circulated, one rooted not in crime, but in the mountain itself. The ridges and snowfields held dangers invisible to outsiders. Old avalanche paths, carved decades earlier, still posed risks. Hidden crevasses, narrow enough to swallow a person whole, lay concealed beneath snow and rock. Searchers spoke quietly about places where a single misstep could mean falling into a void no one would ever see again. If the group had camped or walked unknowingly across such terrain, they might have disappeared in an instant. The absence of gear could be explained by snowpack shifting, burying everything beyond reach. It was a theory grim in its simplicity. The mountain had claimed them. But theories, no matter how detailed, were not evidence. Families gathered at town halls, pleading for answers, trading speculations late into the night. Some insisted foul play had to be involved. Others believed nature had hidden the truth. Investigators grew careful in their language, acknowledging every possibility but confirming none. The official line was that the case remained open but inactive, pending new leads. In reality, it had shifted into something colder, a mystery filed away in cabinets, marked by photographs of 4 smiling young faces, and notes that offered no resolution. By the first anniversary, the search was no longer active. Vigils were held, flowers laid at the trailhead, and news crews returned only briefly to capture the grief still hanging in the air. Each passing year added distance, and with distance came resignation. Theories in the snow remained theories, never rising above speculation. The families lived in 2 worlds at once, grieving children who might be gone, but still waiting for the phone call that would explain what really happened. And the mountain, silent as ever, kept its secret buried deep. Time passed, but the families refused to let the silence become the final word. In the first months after the search ended, they organized vigils in the town square, gathering neighbors, friends, and strangers who wanted to show support. Candles flickered against the late summer air, their light illuminating photographs taped to poster boards, 4 smiling young faces frozen in time. Volunteers distributed flyers to nearby cities, gas stations, and trailhead bulletin boards, each page carrying the same headline, "Missing 4 campers," and the same plea for information. Television crews occasionally returned, interviewing parents who sat stiffly in their living rooms, surrounded by school portraits and dusty trophies. They spoke with a blend of sorrow and determination, insisting their children were still out there, waiting to be found. "They didn't just vanish," one mother told a reporter, her voice breaking. "Someone knows something." But the coverage always faded after a few days. Other stories took the spotlight, and the mystery slipped back into quiet obscurity, known mostly to locals and the families who couldn't move on. The trailhead, once the site of frantic activity and search tents, became a place of pilgrimage. On the first anniversary, dozens gathered there. The families unveiled a small wooden sign they had carved themselves, inscribed with the names of the missing. They left flowers at its base, the bright colors a painful contrast against the gray gravel of the parking lot. Some brought handwritten notes sealed in plastic bags, tacking them to the signpost in hopes the words would reach the ones who never came home. Others simply stood in silence, staring toward the ridgeline as if expecting their loved ones to appear. For the siblings left behind, the years stretched strangely. They grew older, graduated, got jobs, and started families of their own, but they carried the burden of absence like an invisible sibling who never aged. Birthdays came and went without celebration. Holidays were quiet, one chair always empty at the table. They described living in a kind of suspended state, never fully able to grieve because there was no body, no proof. Their brother or sister might still be alive, or they might have died that first night. That uncertainty, year after year, became its own kind of torture. Parents coped in different ways. Some pushed for renewed searches, lobbying the sheriff's office to reopen the case every few years, arguing that advances in technology or fresh sets of eyes might uncover something new. Others turned inward, preserving bedrooms as shrines. Beds remained neatly made, clothes hung in closets, posters still taped to the walls. Time inside those rooms had stopped, a stubborn refusal to accept that life outside had moved on. Couples strained under the weight of grief. Some marriages fractured, others grew quiet but enduring, bonded only by the shared absence of their children. The mountain itself changed in their minds. Once a place of beauty, it became an adversary, a cruel presence that had swallowed their loved ones without explanation. Some family members stopped hiking altogether, unable to look at a trail without thinking of the one where the four had vanished. Others forced themselves to return, climbing the ridgeline each summer, leaving flowers or trinkets in hidden places, speaking aloud as if the missing could hear them. Locals began calling the area the Campers Trail, a nickname heavy with dread. Few wanted to walk it after dark. Every anniversary brought a brief resurgence of attention. Local newspapers ran short pieces, updating readers with the painful reminder that nothing had changed. The families would gather at the trailhead, light candles, and tell stories. Photographs of the four, forever young, would appear on the evening news. The vigils grew smaller as years went on, the crowds thinning until only the closest friends and family remained. Hope dimmed, but it never fully disappeared. Even 2 decades later, parents admitted they still glanced at unfamiliar faces in crowds, wondering for a fleeting second if their missing child had somehow returned. The mountain gave nothing back. No hikers stumbled on discarded gear, no hunters reported bones in the brush, no storms exposed hidden clues. It was as if the earth itself had sealed away the truth, leaving the families to live in the shadow of unanswered questions. They learned to endure, to raise children and bury parents, to carry on with lives that felt permanently incomplete. But through all of it, the memory of that summer in 2006 lingered, pressing on them with quiet weight. Hope never fully died. It dimmed, it hardened, it reshaped itself into something quieter and more fragile, but it remained. Because as long as there were names carved into that wooden sign at the trailhead, the families believed the story wasn't finished. Something had happened on that mountain, something still hidden. And one day, whether by accident or miracle, the truth would surface. By 2012, 6 years had passed since the 4 young campers walked into the mountains and never returned. Their families still carried the weight of absence, but the case had long gone cold. It wasn't until a change in leadership at the sheriff's department that the file was pulled again. A newly appointed detective, known for tackling dormant investigations, reopened the boxes of evidence. Inside were binders filled with search grids, aerial photographs, weather logs, and transcripts of interviews that had grown brittle with time. The detective believed that sometimes what was overlooked in the heat of a frantic search could reveal itself later, when the urgency was gone and only patience remained. He began by re-examining the terrain. Topographical maps were spread across his desk, annotated with pencil markings from the original search teams. They showed the ridges, valleys, and avalanche chutes where rescuers had combed line by line. He compared them with weather reports from the week of the disappearance. The logs confirmed what families had always insisted: the weather had been mild. There were no storms strong enough to bury 4 campers, no flooding events large enough to sweep them away. The mountain had been quiet. Too quiet, some might say, for such a sudden disappearance to make sense. Next, he reviewed the witness accounts collected during those early weeks. Dozens of hikers and hunters had been interviewed in 2006. Most had seen nothing unusual, but one report, buried deep in the file, caught his attention. A group of campers, pitched several miles from the ridge, had described hearing distant screams one night, the same weekend the 4 went missing. The screams were faint, carried by the wind, and difficult to place. At the time, search coordinators had dismissed the account, believing it could have been echoes or even animals. Now, 6 years later, it carried a different weight. Could the sounds have come from the missing hikers, stranded and calling for help? The detective tracked down one of the original witnesses who still lived in the area. When interviewed again, the man's memory had faded, but he insisted the sounds had been human. It was high-pitched, he recalled, like someone was in trouble, but it was far away. We couldn't tell where it came from. The detective noted it carefully, though he knew memory could distort with time. Without corroborating evidence, It was little more than a haunting possibility. He turned to another puzzle that had baffled experts from the beginning: the absence of physical remains. In most wilderness disappearances, even years later, something is eventually found: shredded clothing, a boot, bones scattered by wildlife. But in this case, the mountain had yielded nothing. Searchers, hunters, even chance hikers had reported no discoveries in the years since. It was as if the four had walked into a space outside of reach, leaving no trace behind. Forensic experts consulted on the review admitted they were puzzled. Nature is relentless. It rarely leaves things untouched. And yet, here, 6 years later, there was still nothing. The detective considered foul play again, combing through early suspect lists and checking for overlooked leads. No evidence pointed to another person being involved. No DNA, no fingerprints, no suspicious sightings. He interviewed locals who had long whispered about strangers in the area, but each account dissolved under scrutiny. There were no missing weapons, no stolen vehicles, no financial motives. As one deputy put it at the time, if someone did this, they were ghosts too. What the detective had in the end was a file of contradictions: a clear trailhead with a parked car, boot prints that led onto a ridge and then disappeared, weather too mild for disaster, no evidence of animal attack, no gear recovered, no remains, and a single account of screams that could never be verified. It painted a picture not of neglect or oversight, but of a mystery that refused to align with logic. The families welcomed the renewed effort, but were left disheartened when it yielded no breakthroughs. They had hoped that technology or fresh eyes might uncover something concrete. Instead, the detective could only confirm what had already been known: 4 young campers had vanished, and the mountain had erased every trace of them. By late 2012, the review was quietly closed again. The files returned to storage, neatly labeled but unresolved. The case was once more categorized as inactive, awaiting the improbable chance that evidence might surface. For the families, it was another cruel blow. 6 years had passed, and they were no closer to answers than they had been the day their children disappeared. The only thing the review accomplished was to remind everyone that the mountain still held its silence. Theories circulated again: whispers of hidden crevasses, sudden avalanches, even dark speculation about human predators. But without bodies, without belongings, everything remained conjecture. In the official record, the 4 were still missing, and the trail, once again, went cold. Time dragged forward, and the mountain remained silent. Each year delivered its own cycle of brutal winters and scorching summers, the seasons tearing at the landscape in slow, relentless shifts. Snow layered over snow, avalanches thundered down chutes, and glacial ice ground forward inch by inch. What had been left behind in 2006, whatever fate the 4 campers had met, was hidden deeper with every passing season. Searchers no longer came. Detectives no longer returned. Only the families did, gathering at the trailhead year after year, staring at a ridgeline that kept its secret buried under ice and rock. By 2020, 14 years after the disappearance, the case had hardened into local folklore. People spoke of the 4 campers with the same tone reserved for ghost stories: always present, never explained. The trail where their car had been found was still hiked, but uneasily. Visitors felt the weight of absence there, a reminder of how quickly the wilderness could consume human lives without a trace. Theories had long since become permanent fixtures of conversation. Some swore the group had walked into an avalanche chute. Others whispered of hidden crevasses waiting like open mouths beneath the snow. That summer, rumors began to spread. A pair of hikers claimed they had spotted something strange on the glacier high above the valley: a scrap of fabric fluttering in the wind against the stark white of ice. They described it as unnatural, bright against the snow, like a piece of clothing or a tent wall torn loose. They tried to scramble closer but were forced back by unstable footing and the danger of rockfall. When they reported it, rangers went up to investigate, combing the edge of the glacier with binoculars. They found nothing: no fabric, no color. Nothing out of place. The hikers were told they must have seen wind-blown debris or a trick of the light. But the story spread. Soon, other hikers came forward, insisting they too had glimpsed something high on the ridge: a flicker of red, a glint of metal, a flash of something too deliberate to be natural. Each account was vague, inconsistent, and unverified. Rangers logged the reports but always returned empty-handed. In the absence of proof, the rumors settled into the larger mystery, another thread in a story already woven with too many loose ends. For the families, though, those rumors struck differently. They saw possibility in the fabric, the suggestion that the mountain had not erased everything, only hidden it. "Snow preserves what it swallows," one of the mothers said in an interview. She believed her daughter's belongings, maybe even her remains, were still up there somewhere, locked beneath layers of ice, waiting to be revealed by time and weather. Others echoed her hope. The idea became a small comfort. The mountain hadn't destroyed their children, only concealed them. Scientists and mountaineers supported that belief. Glaciers often release what they consume decades later, spitting out frozen artifacts and bodies long after the events that buried them. Climbers lost in the 1960s had been found perfectly preserved half a century later, their clothing intact, their gear still recognizable. What the mountain takes, it sometimes gives back, but on its own schedule, not on human time. That knowledge was both comforting and cruel. Comforting because it meant the four might one day be found. Cruel because there was no way to know when. Storms continued to shape the terrain. Each winter brought heavy snow, avalanches ripping paths down the mountain with terrifying force. Each summer brought melting, exposing rocks and reshaping the ridges. Searchers speculated quietly that the group's final campsite might have been swept into one of those avalanche paths, buried beneath tons of snow that hardened into ice year after year. If so, the campers would remain hidden until the right storm, the right melt, exposed them once again. By the close of 2020, the case remained officially unchanged. 4 names on a cold case list, 4 faces in fading photographs, 4 lives unresolved. But within the families, within the community, a shift had taken place. No longer did people ask if the mountain had taken them. The question had become when the mountain might give them back. The discovery came not through deliberate search, but by accident. In the winter of 2025, a helicopter from the state's aviation unit was flying a routine patrol along the ridgeline. The mission had nothing to do with the long-vanished campers. The crew was tasked with monitoring snowpack levels and scanning for avalanche risks, a precaution before the spring thaw. The helicopter's rotors thudded through the cold air, sweeping across peaks dusted in fresh snow. Visibility was good, the sky pale and clear. And the flight followed the same route crews had flown countless times before. Nothing ever changed, until that morning. One of the crew members leaned out, scanning the snowfield below. At first it seemed ordinary, white drifts broken only by jagged rocks. But then his eye caught a line, sharp and geometric, out of place in the natural landscape. He squinted, leaning farther. It was a shape, rectangular, too regular to be formed by snow or ice. He gestured urgently to the pilot, and the helicopter banked, circling back for another pass. Beneath them, half buried in the snowfield, something emerged. A block of color, faint but visible beneath translucent ice. Faded nylon, stretched and flattened, still clinging to its original shape. A tent. The discovery was unmistakable. The crew called it in immediately, their voices tight with disbelief. Coordinates were logged, photographs snapped, and within hours, word reached the sheriff's office. For nearly 2 decades, the mountain had offered nothing but silence. Now, at last, it had given up a piece of the mystery. The news spread fast. Next day, families who had spent 19 years living in uncertainty were contacted with the update. For them, the words struck like a thunderclap. A tent has been found. It was the first tangible evidence since the car at the trailhead in 2006. Parents who had aged beneath the weight of waiting, siblings who had grown up with absence instead of answers, suddenly faced the possibility that the end of their story was near. Hope and dread twisted together. A tent could mean anything. Officials cautioned patience. Photographs showed only a portion of the object, bright nylon pressed flat, half exposed by recent avalanches. No one could confirm yet if it belonged to the missing group. Other hikers had used the mountain for decades. Gear was often lost and abandoned, but the location was telling. The tent lay high on the glacier, miles from the marked trail, directly in one of the avalanche chutes searchers had always speculated about. Its position, its age, its isolation, it all pointed toward the fore. Within days, a plan was drawn. A specialized recovery team would ascend to the snowfield once weather allowed. The site was dangerous, prone to slides, and the tent itself lay in a precarious position, partly encased in hardened ice. Crews would need cutting tools, ropes, and hours of delicate work to expose it without triggering collapse. Officials spoke carefully to the press, refusing to speculate, but their words carried the weight of possibility. "We may finally learn what happened," one ranger admitted quietly. The families gathered again, just as they had so many times before. This time, though, the air was different. For 19 years, anniversaries had been marked by flowers and candles at a wooden sign carved with names. Now, there was something tangible to attach those names to. Mothers wept on camera, torn between relief that evidence had finally surfaced and anguish at what it meant. A tent was not a sign of survival. A tent was a sign of where life had ended. Investigators prepared their case files once again, dusting off old maps and search grids. Detectives who had been young deputies in 2006 now wore lines on their faces and gray in their hair, but the story had followed them their entire careers. Many admitted they had wondered if they would ever see closure. Now, closure seemed possible, though no one dared to say certain. On the mountain, the helicopter crew who had spotted the tent returned quietly to their routines, but their names were added to the story's long list of players. They had not set out to solve a mystery, but to measure snow. And yet, with a single glance, they had changed the trajectory of a case that had haunted families and investigators for nearly 2 decades. The discovery reignited everything: old grief, old questions, old fears. It brought journalists back, news vans parking at the base of the trailhead just as they had in 2006. It drew strangers who left flowers beneath the wooden sign once more, whispering that maybe, finally, the truth would be known. The mountain had kept its silence for 19 years. Now, with a single glimpse of faded nylon in the snow, it had spoken. What remained was to uncover the rest. When the news of the tent broke, preparation for the recovery began immediately. This was no longer an active rescue. It was an excavation, a delicate attempt to retrieve answers from beneath nearly 2 decades of ice and snow. A specialized team was assembled, made up of mountain rangers, forensic investigators, and avalanche experts. They carried drones to scout the terrain, ice-cutting saws designed to slice through hardened layers, and ropes to navigate the unstable chute where the tent lay. The climb itself was dangerous. The site was high on the glacier, positioned directly in a natural avalanche path. Every movement risked triggering another slide. Crews advanced cautiously, step by step, their boots sinking into snow that had frozen and thawed countless times since 2006. Drones buzzed ahead, capturing aerial images that guided their route and confirmed the location. When the team finally reached the snowfield, they saw it with their own eyes, a faint rectangle of nylon pressed flat beneath translucent ice, just as the helicopter crew had described. The tent was collapsed, its once bright fabric faded but still recognizable. The site carried a weight that silenced the group. For years, the case had been speculation, theory, rumor. Now it was tangible. Evidence. Proof that the four had not simply vanished, but had camped here, on this very spot. Excavation began immediately. Using saws and picks, the team worked carefully to chip away at the ice surrounding the tent. Every strike echoed in the frozen chute. Hours passed, the cold air biting at their faces as they freed sections of fabric and poles from their icy tomb. Slowly, the tent began to emerge, flattened and torn, but still intact enough to recognize its structure. Inside, collapsed beneath snow, lay the remnants of a campsite that had been sealed away since the summer of 2006. The first discovery was cooking gear, metal pots and a small stove, remarkably preserved. The items were scattered but not destroyed, as if buried quickly rather than torn apart. A plastic food container still bore faded labels, the ink blurred but legible. These were the belongings of the 4 missing campers, finally brought back into the light after 19 years. Then came the moment that confirmed what families had feared all along. As investigators dug deeper into the collapsed tent, they uncovered human remains. Bones, partially clothed, preserved by ice. The find was handled with the utmost care, marked and catalogued, but no one on the recovery team could deny the gravity of what they had unearthed. The 4 had been here, alive long enough to set up camp, only to be overtaken by disaster. Forensic experts quickly concluded the site had been buried by an avalanche. The position of the tent, directly in the chute, high above the trail, was a fatal mistake. Unwittingly, the group had chosen one of the most dangerous places to camp. When the avalanche came, likely in the dead of night, it had swept down with unimaginable force, collapsing the tent and entombing them instantly beneath snow and ice. The preservation was striking. Items that should have deteriorated long ago had survived, locked in the cold. Clothing still clung to some of the remains. A watch, frozen in place, bore a stopped time. Investigators believed the avalanche had struck swiftly, leaving the campers no chance to escape. The evidence suggested they had not been reckless, only unlucky. They had pitched their tent in the wrong place, at the wrong time, and nature had sealed their fate. Word of the discovery spread quickly back to the families. Some wept openly when told that remains had been found. Others simply sat in silence, processing the truth that had eluded them for nearly 2 decades. Closure was coming, but closure came at a cost. The 4 were no longer lost, but they were gone. The recovery stretched over days. Each piece of gear, each bone fragment, each scrap of fabric was carefully extracted, catalogued, and flown down the mountain by helicopter. The site was mapped extensively, photographs capturing the eerie preservation of a campsite frozen in time. Experts marveled at how the snow had sealed the scene like a vault, protecting it until storms and melt finally exposed it once more. By the end of the mission, the tent was fully unearthed, its fabric folded carefully into evidence bags. The cooking gear, the personal items, and the human remains were carried down the mountain, escorted with quiet reverence. For the first time in 19 years, the story of the missing campers had shifted from speculation to fact. The mountain had given back its secret, and with it came the beginning of answers, the kind that explained what had happened, but never why fate had chosen those 4, on that night, in that place. Once the remains and belongings were brought down from the glacier, the task of piecing together the truth began. Forensic investigators, avalanche experts, and pathologists gathered in a quiet lab far from the mountain, their work guided by nearly 2 decades of unanswered questions. Families waited for phone calls that could finally provide the closure they had begged for. What had happened to the 4 young campers was no longer a matter of speculation. The evidence, frozen in time, was ready to speak. The tent told the first part of the story. Its position on the slope left little doubt about what had gone wrong. Experts confirmed that it had been set up directly in the path of a known avalanche chute. At the time in 2006, there were no clear markers warning hikers of the danger. To 4 young campers, the spot would have looked ideal, a flat section with shelter from wind, close enough to the ridge to offer morning views. But what seemed safe was in fact a fatal mistake. The moment they staked their tent, they had placed themselves in a natural kill zone. Inside the recovered gear, investigators found clear signs the campers had been alive long enough to settle in. Cooking equipment was unpacked, food containers were opened, sleeping bags had been unrolled. It suggested they had eaten, laughed, maybe told stories, and then drifted into sleep, unaware that tons of snow and ice loomed above them, waiting for a trigger. At some point during the night, perhaps caused by wind, melting, or the natural shifting of snowpack, the slope above released. The avalanche struck fast and without warning, collapsing the tent and burying everything beneath meters of snow. The remains told the next chapter. Autopsies revealed crushing trauma consistent with avalanche debris. Bones showed fractures and compressions from the weight of snow and ice pressing down with unimaginable force. Some had injuries that indicated immediate death. Others may have survived only moments longer, trapped with no air, suffocating beneath the slide. Experts emphasized that an avalanche of that size would have given them no chance to react. No flashlight switch was flipped, no zipper pulled. They were asleep one moment, and the next they were entombed. What struck investigators most was the absence of anything suspicious. The scene contained no evidence of foul play. There were no defensive wounds, no signs of a struggle, no indication that another person had been involved. The arrangement of gear was ordinary: food, stoves, and personal belongings in logical places. Even the watches and clothing suggested routine camping preparations, nothing frantic or unusual. Every detail pointed toward a group that had been enjoying an ordinary night outdoors before nature intervened. Forensic teams reconstructed their final moments with painstaking care. They laid out the tent poles, the fragments of fabric, the pots, and the remains as they might have been on that summer evening. The picture that emerged was tragically simple. 4 friends seeking reunion and adventure had chosen a campsite that hid lethal danger. They cooked, they ate, they unrolled their sleeping bags. And while they slept, the mountain shifted. An avalanche thundered down the chute, crushing the tent, sealing them in, and burying the truth for nearly 2 decades. For avalanche experts, the case became a somber teaching tool. They explained to reporters how deceptive terrain can lure campers into fatal mistakes. Snowpack layers, invisible to the eye, build instability that can collapse without warning. A site that seems safe can in fact be deadly. To the families, these explanations mattered, but they didn't soften the blow. Knowing the science behind the avalanche did little to ease the grief of learning their children had died in their sleep, their lives cut short in an instant. Interviews with the families following the forensic confirmation revealed a complicated mix of emotions. There was sorrow, of course, but also relief that the specter of foul play had finally been erased. For years, some had lived with the suspicion that their loved ones had met a darker fate, an attack, a crime, something violent. Now they knew the truth. It had not been human malice. It had been the mountain itself, indifferent, unstoppable. The release of information brought the case back into the headlines one final time. News outlets ran stories titled "Truth in the Ice" and "19-Year Mystery Solved." Images of the tent and recovered gear circulated, haunting reminders of lives interrupted. Search and rescue officials used the case to remind future hikers of the importance of understanding avalanche terrain, of respecting the hidden dangers that lie even in summer months. The tragedy became both a story of loss and a cautionary tale. For the investigators who had carried the case in the back of their minds for nearly 2 decades, the resolution brought an end to years of speculation. No longer would they revisit the old files wondering if they had missed something. No longer would they question whether the screams reported by distant campers had been a clue they failed to act on. The answers had been frozen in ice all along, waiting for storms and melt to reveal them. When officials sat down with the families to share the final conclusions, the room was filled with silence. Parents clutched photographs, siblings wiped away tears. The words were clinical but devastating. Their loved ones had died in an avalanche, buried instantly in 2006. No crime, no foul play, just a simple, merciless act of nature. The families nodded, some wept, others sat still, the truth settling over them like the snow that had hidden it for so long. It was the resolution they had begged for, but it came with the bitter knowledge that answers did not erase grief. The mountain had kept them waiting 19 years. Now it had spoken, and the truth was as tragic as it was inevitable. The call came to the families in the early spring of 2025. After nearly 2 decades of waiting, of vigils and unanswered questions, the sheriff's office confirmed that the remains recovered from the glacier had been positively identified. DNA analysis, dental records, and personal belongings left no doubt. The 4 missing campers were home again, though not in the way anyone had once dreamed. For years, the families had imagined reunions, rescue, or some improbable survival story. Now, there was only truth. Their loved ones had died on the mountain in 2006, their bodies hidden beneath snow and ice until storms and thaw revealed them at last. The confirmation carried a strange weight. Some parents described it as relief. At least, the waiting was over. The torment of not knowing finally ended. Others described it as crushing, a finality they had dreaded since the first day of the search. For siblings who had grown up in the shadow of absence, the news was surreal. They had become adults during those 19 years, carrying forward memories of brothers and sisters frozen at 20 years old. To suddenly have their story concluded was like reopening a wound that had never healed. Plans for a memorial took shape quickly. It was decided there would be a joint service at the trailhead where their car had once been found, where families had gathered every year to light candles and whisper prayers into the mountain air. Now they would gather one last time, not to beg for answers, but to lay their children to rest. The day of the memorial dawned cold and clear. Snow still lingered on the higher peaks, glinting in the sun as if the mountain itself was watching. Families, friends, and strangers who had followed the case over the years arrived in silence. At the base of the trail, the wooden sign carved with the 4 names stood taller than it had 19 years earlier, weathered but enduring. Around it, flowers, photographs, and notes were placed in piles that grew throughout the day. Some brought hiking boots, worn and laced, left as symbols of the journey that had ended too soon. The service was quiet, marked more by silence than by words. A pastor spoke briefly, but most of the time was given to the families themselves. Parents told stories of childhoods now frozen in memory, birthdays, laughter, camping trips before the final one. Siblings read letters they had written over the years, words once left at vigils now spoken aloud with trembling voices. Some described the strange in-between years when hope and grief had lived side by side, when every ring of the phone had been both a promise and a threat. Others admitted to dreams where the missing returned, only to vanish again upon waking. At the center of the gathering stood 4 urns, simple and unadorned, containing what remained after 19 years beneath the snow. They were placed together, side by side, just as the 4 had been in life. Later, the families would decide privately where to bury or scatter them, but for that day, they remained united at the place their journey began. Reporters attended, though they kept their distance. For once, the story was not about speculation or theories, but about closure. Headlines the next morning carried words like answers, final truth, and closure after 19 years. But for those who loved the 4, closure was not an ending. It was only the acceptance of a reality they had resisted for so long. They now knew what had happened, but knowing did not erase the grief. It only gave it shape. Officials, too, acknowledged the cruel simplicity of the truth. There had been no foul play, no dark conspiracy, no hidden predator, just 4 young campers who had unknowingly pitched their tent in the wrong place at the wrong time. They had been swallowed by snow in the dead of night, their story buried until weather and chance revealed it nearly 2 decades later. The mountain had not been malevolent, only indifferent. Yet to the families, indifference was no comfort. It was a reminder of how fragile life becomes in the wilderness, how easily it can be erased. As the memorial ended, a final gesture was made. The families approached the wooden sign together and nailed a new plaque to its base. It read, "Found at last. May they rest where they walked." The words were simple, but they carried the weight of 19 years of silence, 19 years of dread, 19 years of hope that had finally given way to truth. When the crowd dispersed, the mountain was quiet again. The trail remained, winding upward toward the ridges, inviting new hikers into the same wilderness that had claimed the 4. But for those who had lived through the mystery, the landscape was forever changed. Every gust of wind across the peaks, every shifting snowfield, seemed to echo the story of lives cut short and of answers held hostage by nature itself. The families returned home with the truth, finally freed from the endless cycle of speculation and rumor. They no longer had to wonder. They no longer had to search. But in their hearts, the absence remained as permanent as the peaks themselves. They had their closure, but closure was not peace. It was only the end of a long silence. For 19 years, the mountain had kept its secret. For 19 years, it had held the 4 close, hidden beneath snow and ice, unreachable by searchers, untouched by time. And then, at last, the snow had let go.